The Ethelgard was less a restaurant and more a vault where Chicago's elite stored their secrets. Its windows were one-way mirrors facing the city, allowing the patrons to look down on the world without the world looking back. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old money and new ambition, a place where fortunes were made over seared foie gras and empires crumbled over vintage Bordeaux. In this gilded ecosystem, Serafina Vitali was plankton. She was a ghost in a black uniform, her movement so quiet and self-effacing that diners often forgot she was there until their water glass was magically full again. At 24, she had mastered the art of invisibility. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes were perpetually fixed on the floor, and her voice was a whisper reserved for confirming an order. This anonymity was her shield, a carefully constructed fortress against a past she could feel but not fully remember. Tonight, however, the fortress was about to be breached. "The Falcone party is confirmed for 9, Mr. Davies, the manager, hissed, his voice a low thrum of panic. He was a man perpetually sweating through his silk shirts. Not just the son, the father is with him. The old man. A chill went through the kitchen staff. Lorenzo Falcone was a known quantity, a ruthless modern predator who had laundered his family's blood-soaked legacy into a legitimate multi-billion-dollar real estate empire. He was cold, precise, and dangerous. But his father, Don Marco Falcone, was a legend, a ghost from the old country. They called him the Vulture, a man who had carved his name into the mountains of Sicily with violence and fear before his son brought the family into the 21st century. He hadn't set foot in America in 30 years. "Serafina!" Davies snapped, grabbing her arm. His fingers dug into her flesh. "You are on peripheral tables only. Do you understand? You do not make eye contact. You do not speak. You are a shadow. Julian will be serving them. He's smooth. You're too timid. One wrong move tonight could close us down. Permanently." "Yes, Mr. Davies," she murmured, her gaze fixed on a scuff mark on his Italian leather shoes. She preferred the periphery. Shadows were safe. In the shadows, no one asked questions. No one saw the ghost of her grandmother in the shape of her eyes. She moved through the pre-dinner service like a phantom, her mind a quiet hum of tasks. Polish the silver, align the salt cellars, ensure every glass was free of the slightest smudge. But beneath the placid surface, a strange current of dread and anticipation pulled at her. Falcone. The name was a splinter under her skin, a word her nonna used to whisper in her sleep, wrapped in prayers and curses. At precisely 9 o'clock, the restaurant's heavy oak doors swung open as if yielding to a force of nature. 2 men in sharp, dark suits entered first, their eyes sweeping the room with the cold efficiency of predators. They were a wall. Then, the wall parted. Lorenzo Falcone entered. He was a man carved from marble and ice, his bespoke suit clinging to a frame built for violence, his face a mask of bored indifference that did little to hide the calculating mind behind his dark eyes. He was the king of this city, and he walked as if he owned the very air everyone else breathed. But the room didn't hold its breath for Lorenzo. It held its breath for the old man leaning on his arm. Don Marco Falcone was smaller, stooped with age, a relic from another era. He wore a heavy wool coat despite the warmth of the room, and leaned on a gnarled olive-wood cane. His face was a road map of a brutal life, his skin weathered and scarred, his eyes sunken but burning with a black, unholy fire. He was the Vulture, and he looked as though he had come to pick the bones of this new, soft world. As they were led to the secluded VIP table on a raised dais, A blanket of absolute silence fell over the Ethelgard. The clinking of forks, the murmur of conversation, the soft jazz from the speakers. It all died. This was not respect. It was primal fear. Serafina watched from her station near the kitchen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the way the old man walked, favoring his right leg. She saw the way he gripped his cane, not for support, but like a weapon. These were not observations. They were echoes, fragments of her grandmother's whispered stories, bedtime tales of monsters and mountains that were more real than any fairy tale. Julian, the chosen waiter, approached the table. He was handsome, confident, and utterly out of his depth. He smiled his practiced, charming smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. An honor to have you. May I start you with some of our finest champagne?" Don Marco slowly, deliberately, placed his hat on the empty chair beside him. He looked at Julian, and in that gaze was the weight of 1,000 Sicilian funerals. He said nothing. Lorenzo sighed, a barely audible sound of weary patience. Still water for my father, and for me. No ice. "Of course," Julian said, his smile faltering. He poured the water from a crystal carafe, serving Lorenzo first. Serafina flinched. "A mistake. You always serve the head of the table first. It was a rule as old as bread and wine." Marco's hand shot out, impossibly fast for a man his age, and clamped around Julian's wrist. The carafe trembled, water sloshing onto the pristine white tablecloth. "The father," Marco rasped, his voice like gravel grinding stone. "You serve the father first. This is not a land of children who rule their parents." "My apologies, sir. Julian stammered, his face draining of color. "And you pour with your right hand," Marco continued, his grip tightening, his knuckles white. "The left hand is for thieves and traitors. It is the hand of Judas." "Papa, basta," Lorenzo said, his voice calm, but with a razor's edge. "He doesn't know. Let him go." Marco released the wrist, shoving Julian's hand away in disgust. "He does not know," the old man repeated, his voice rising, drawing the terrified eyes of every patron. "This place, it is a palace with no foundation. It has no respect, no memory." He slammed his hand on the table, the silverware jumping with a sharp clatter. "You bring me to a place with no soul, Lorenzo. I would get more respect from the goats in the hills of Corleone." He looked ready to explode, to overturn the table, to bring the whole glittering facade crashing down. Mr. Davies was frozen near the host stand, his face a mask of pure terror. Security tensed, their hands inching toward their jackets. Serafina didn't make a decision. An instinct, deep and ancient, took over. Her body moved, a vessel for a will that wasn't entirely her own. She turned to the kitchen's bread station, ignoring the perfectly proofed brioche. She grabbed a loaf of the rustic, hard-crusted peasant bread reserved for the staff, the kind with a dark, almost burnt crust and a dense, chewy interior. She snatched a small dish and poured it full of the simple, green, unfiltered olive oil they used for cooking, not the delicate gold-flecked oil for the guests. Her sensible work shoes made sharp, defiant clicks on the marble floor as she walked out of the shadows. Every eye in the room swiveled to her. She could feel Mr. Davies's rage boring into her back like a physical force. She was a dead woman, fired, blacklisted. But she kept walking. She had to. It was a law deeper than any employee handbook. You do not let an elder, a guest, leave with anger in his heart. It brings a curse on the house. She reached the dais. One of Lorenzo's bodyguards, a man built like a refrigerator, stepped into her path. She didn't stop. She met his gaze, her dark eyes holding a quiet, unyielding plea. "For the Don," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The guard hesitated, thrown by her sheer audacity. He saw no threat, only a small, pale waitress holding a basket of bread like an offering. He stepped aside. Serafina approached the table. Lorenzo looked up, his expression a dangerous cocktail of annoyance and curiosity. He had seen every kind of woman try to get his attention. He had never seen one who seemed to be trying to apologize for existing while simultaneously commanding the center of the universe. She ignored him. She ignored the guards. Her world had shrunk to the furious old man standing at the head of the table. She placed the basket of bread down, not in the middle, but directly in front of him. She set down the dish of green oil. Then she did something that made Mr. Davies let out a small, strangled gasp. She reached out and slid Don Marco's wine glass a few inches to the left, aligning it perfectly with the tip of his knife, a sign of order, a sign of respect. She took a deep, steadying breath. The air was electric. She knew English would make her a disobedient servant. Standard Italian would make her a fraud. She had to dig deeper, to the roots, to the language of her grandmother's lullabies, the language of ghosts. She clasped her hands before her, bowed her head slightly, and the words came. Vosia benedica, Don Marco, upani e caudu, manciati e scurdati u vileno. The words were not Italian. They were not even a common Sicilian dialect. They were the archaic, guttural tongue of a specific, isolated mountain region in western Sicily, a dialect of shepherds and olive growers, a dialect that hadn't been spoken in a place like this for 100 years. It meant, Your Excellency, a blessing. The bread is warm. Eat and forget the poison. The effect was a bomb detonating in absolute silence. Don Marco's rage vanished, replaced by a look of such profound shock that his weathered face seemed to crumble. He sank back into his chair as if his legs had been cut out from under him. His burning eyes, which had been spitting fire moments before, were now wide with disbelief. He stared at Serafina as if she were an apparition, a spectre conjured from the dust of his memory. Lorenzo went rigid, his mask of indifference shattered. He looked from his father's stunned face to the small, trembling waitress. He had grown up hearing that dialect in hushed tones, in secret meetings, in conversations that ended abruptly when he entered a room. It was the language of the inner circle, the language of secrets. To hear it from the lips of a waitress in Chicago was impossible. Ci dicisti, Don Marco whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of its authority. What did you say? Serafina held his gaze. She was no longer a shadow. She was the granddaughter of a woman who feared this man, and that history gave her a strange, terrifying strength. I said the bread is warm, Don Marco, she replied, switching to English, but keeping the slow, formal cadence of the old tongue. It is a sin to let good bread grow cold. The old man's hand, spotted with age and scarred from old knife fights, reached out. It trembled. He didn't reach for the bread. He reached for her, his fingers stopping an inch from her face, as if he feared she would dissolve into smoke. Where? He choked out. Where did you learn the tongue of my village? The old words. They are all buried, or they are all forgotten. My nonna, Serafina said, her voice soft but clear. She taught me. She said it was the only way to speak to the saints, and to men who carry mountains on their backs. A short, sharp laugh escaped Lorenzo's lips. It was a sound of pure, incredulous fascination. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes boring into her. The timid mouse from the corner had just revealed the fangs of a wolf. Don Marco studied her face, his gaze intense, searching. He was looking for familiar lines, for the ghost of a face he once knew. "Your nonna," he said, his voice urgent. What was her name? Serafina's heart hammered. This was the precipice. To speak the name was to leap into the abyss, but there was no turning back. "Ariana," she said. "Ariana Bellini." The name struck the table with the force of a physical blow. Don Marco recoiled, his face turning ashen. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Ariana," he whispered, the name a wound. "The weaver's daughter, from the grove by the river, the one who vanished in '88. Serafina nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "She didn't vanish, Don Marco. She fled. She came here. She wove tablecloths for a restaurant in Little Italy for 40 years, until her hands gave out and her heart followed." The old Don closed his eyes, a profound sorrow settling over his harsh features. He looked ancient, defeated. He opened his eyes, looked at the basket, and with a trembling hand broke off a piece of the hard crust. He dipped it in the green oil and brought it to his lips. He chewed slowly, his eyes closed again, as if in prayer. "It tastes," he mumbled, his voice thick with unshed tears, "of home." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a terrifying new light. He looked past Serafina, his gaze landing on the cowering Mr. Davies. "You!" he roared, his voice regaining its thunder. He pointed a shaking finger at the manager. Yes, Don Falcone," Davies squeaked. "This girl," Marco commanded, gesturing to Serafina. "She does not work tonight. Tonight she is my guest. She will sit. She will eat with us." The entire restaurant staff stared, mouths agape. Mr. Davies looked as if he might faint. "Sir, that is highly irregular. It is against restaurant policy for staff to—" Lorenzo's voice cut through the manager's pathetic protests, smooth as silk and sharp as a stiletto. "Mr. Davies, my father has just extended an invitation. Are you telling him no?" "No. No, of course not, Mr. Falcone," Davies stammered, wringing his hands. "Serafina, please. Sit." Serafina froze. "I can't. I'm working." Lorenzo stood. He moved around the table with a predatory grace. He was taller than she'd realized, and he smelled of expensive cologne, leather, and something dangerous, like ozone after a lightning strike. He pulled out the empty chair between himself and his father, a place of honor, a place of peril. "Serafina," Lorenzo said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones. "No one says no to my father." He looked her up and down, his dark eyes glittering with a predatory curiosity. "And frankly, I have to know how a shy waitress in Chicago knows a dialect that has been used as a private code by my family for a century. Sit." She looked at the chair. It was a throne and an electric chair all in one. To sit was to enter their world, to abandon the safety of her invisibility. But as she looked at the old man, who was now gazing at her with a desperate, hungry hope, as if she were the last link to a world he had lost forever, she knew she had no choice. Slowly, she untied the strings of her apron. She folded it and placed it on a nearby service stand. She smoothed the front of her simple black uniform and, with the eyes of the entire Chicago underworld upon her, she sat down at the table of the king. The dinner was a tightrope walk over a canyon. Serafina sat straight-backed, a small bird in a den of wolves. Don Marco, transformed by her presence, ignored his son and everyone else, speaking to her in the old dialect, his voice filled with a nostalgic warmth. He asked about Ariana, about the village, about recipes for caponata and the proper way to cure olives. It was a conversation held across 40 years of silence. Lorenzo, however, was a silent predator. He ate his risotto with a surgeon's precision, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He was not interested in nostalgia. He was a man of the present, and in the present, coincidences were for fools. "So," Lorenzo finally said, breaking into the conversation in English, his voice startlingly loud in the intimate bubble Marco had created. He refilled her wine glass. "The weaver's daughter runs away in 1988, a year of significant turmoil in the old country." "She wanted a better life," Serafina said, her voice tight. "A noble sentiment," Lorenzo replied, swirling the deep red liquid in his glass. "But people like us, Serafina, people from those mountains, we don't run for a better life. We run from a death sentence." What did she see? "Lorenzo," Don Marco warned, his tone sharp. "Leave the girl, we are remembering." "I am trying to understand, Papa," Lorenzo countered, his gaze locked on Serafina. "I'm trying to understand why Ariana Bellini's granddaughter shows up on the one night in 30 years you are here. I'm trying to understand what she wants." "I want nothing," Serafina said, her chin lifting slightly. It was the first spark of defiance she had shown. "Everyone wants something," Lorenzo said with a cold smile. "It is the nature of the world." Before she could reply, the calm of the restaurant was shattered again. The front doors burst open, not with ceremony, but with brute force. 6 men in expensive but ill-fitting suits strode in. They were loud, arrogant, and their accents were thick with the harsh consonants of Eastern Europe. At their center was Victor Orloff, the head of the Bratva in Chicago, a man whose ambition was matched only by his brutality. He had been encroaching on Falcone territory for months, a bloody, undeclared war fought in shipping containers and back alleys. Orloff's eyes scanned the room and landed on the Falcone table. A wide, cruel grin split his face. He walked directly toward them, his men fanning out behind him, a clear challenge. Don Marco did not turn. He simply picked up his knife and began to butter a piece of bread. "Marco!" Orloff boomed, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. "I heard the old ghost was back in town. I see you are enjoying the local entertainment." He sneered, his gaze falling contemptuously on Serafina. Lorenzo rose slowly, a fluid, dangerous movement. He buttoned his jacket. "Victor, you have a talent for arriving where you are not welcome." "I am always welcome where there is money to be made," Orloff laughed. He stepped onto the dais, a blatant act of disrespect. His men moved with him. The Falcone bodyguards shifted, hands disappearing inside their coats. The air crackled, thick with the promise of violence. Orloff looked at Serafina, his eyes lingering on her with a slimy appraisal. "What is this, Lorenzo? A new toy? You get tired of the models and actresses?" He reached out a thick, meaty hand, intending to touch her hair. It happened faster than a breath. Lorenzo's hand shot out and seized Orloff's wrist. The crack of bone and cartilage was sickeningly audible. Orloff grunted in pain, his face contorting. "Touch her," Lorenzo whispered, his voice a low, deadly hiss. "And you will leave this restaurant in a bag." "Several bags." Orloff ripped his hand away, cradling his wrist. He glared at Serafina with pure venom. "You fight for a waitress now, Falcone? You have gone soft." He spat on the floor. It was then that one of Orloff's men, seeing Lorenzo distracted, made his move. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He lunged for Serafina, his hand shot out, grabbing not for her, but for the thin silver chain around her neck. With a sharp tug, the chain snapped. He ripped the small, tarnished silver locket from her throat and spun away, tossing it to another of his men who was already backing toward the door. "No!" Serafina cried out, the word torn from her, a sound of pure agony. She lunged forward, but Lorenzo held her back. The locket. It was the only thing she had. Her grandmother had given it to her, on her deathbed. "This is your truth," she had whispered. "It is the key." The theft was a calculated insult, a move designed to humiliate, not to kill. Orloff laughed, a booming, ugly sound. "A souvenir," he shouted, "to remember the night the great Falcones were protected by a little girl." With that, they were gone, retreating out the door before the Falcone guards could open fire in the crowded restaurant. The chaos subsided, leaving a crater of humiliation and shock. Lorenzo turned to Serafina. His face was a thundercloud of rage, but when he saw her expression, the fury softened into something else. Her face was a mask of utter devastation. She wasn't scared. She was broken. Her hand was at her throat, where the locket used to be, her eyes wide with a grief so profound it silenced the entire room. "It's gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He took it. He took everything." Lorenzo looked from her shattered expression to the door his enemies had just escaped through. He had just discovered the most fascinating, dangerous puzzle of his life. A girl who held the key to his family's oldest secrets. And now, that key was gone, stolen by his most ruthless rival. She was no longer just a curiosity. She was a liability, a target, and the center of a storm that was about to consume them all. The shy waitress had been dragged from the shadows, only to have her very identity stolen from her in the blinding, violent light. The ride to the Falcone estate was a journey through a tunnel of silence and speed. Serafina sat in the back of an armored sedan that sliced through the Chicago night, the city lights smearing into abstract streaks of neon and gold. Lorenzo sat beside her, a block of coiled fury, his jaw set so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. In the front passenger seat, Don Marco stared out the window, his reflection a ghostly mask of sorrow and rage. He had not spoken a word since they'd left the restaurant. The estate wasn't a house, it was a fortress, a modern castle of stone and black glass perched on the edge of Lake Michigan. As iron gates slid open, Serafina felt the world she knew, the world of worn-out shoes and whispered apologies, recede behind her, swallowed by the night. She was a ghost crossing into the underworld. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling of polished wood and old secrets. A severe-looking woman in a housekeeper's uniform appeared. "Take her to the East Wing," Lorenzo commanded, his voice raw. "Find her something to wear. Something else." Serafina clutched the front of her simple black uniform. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it stopped Lorenzo halfway up a grand, sweeping staircase. He turned, his eyes burning down at her. "My apron is at the restaurant," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "But this uniform, my nonna helped me mend the hem last year. It is mine. I will keep it." Lorenzo studied her for a long moment, the anger in his eyes warring with a dawning, dangerous fascination. He saw the defiance in her posture, the unwavering set of her chin. She had lost everything, yet she was clinging to this last piece of her identity. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "As you wish." He led her not to a guest suite, but to a vast library. Bookshelves soared 2 stories high, filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, large enough to stand in. Don Marco entered behind them, leaning heavily on his olive-wood cane, and sank into a deep leather armchair by the fire. He looked like a king who had just lost his kingdom. "She gave me the proof," the old man rasped, speaking to the flames. "Ariana, she sent me proof of her granddaughter, and I let it be stolen from my own table." "We will get it back, Papa," Lorenzo said, his voice a low growl. "I will burn Orlov's entire organization to the ground. I will flay the man who touched her. The locket will be returned." Serafina's mind was a maelstrom of grief. The locket, the cool, tarnished silver in her palm, her nonna's dying words, her breath smelling of fennel and regret. "This is your truth. It is the key." But as the words echoed in the silence of the grand library, they began to shift, to rearrange themselves. Her nonna had been a weaver. For a weaver, a key was not always a piece of metal that opened a lock. Sometimes a key was a pattern, a starting point. "He can keep the locket," Serafina said suddenly. Both men turned to stare at her. Lorenzo's expression was one of disbelief. Don Marco's was one of deep, weary confusion. "It's gone," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "What was inside it is gone. But it wasn't the proof. It was the promise of it." She looked at her own hands, remembering the feel of thread, the rhythm of the loom her nonna had kept in the corner of their tiny apartment, a relic she'd insisted on shipping from Sicily. "My nonna," she said, looking directly at Don Marco. She didn't trust banks. She didn't trust men with guns or promises. She trusted her hands. She trusted her craft. She paused, the idea blooming in her mind. A terrifying and beautiful revelation. She always said, "The tongue can lie, the pen can be broken, but the thread remembers everything." Lorenzo stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "What are you saying, Serafina?" "She worked for 40 years, Serafina whispered, her eyes wide with dawning certainty. "At a restaurant in Little Italy, Giardino's. She wove their tablecloths, dozens of them. She said everyone was a prayer. But what if one of them was a ledger?" A profound stillness filled the room. Don Marco slowly rose from his chair, his eyes fixed on her, the firelight dancing in their dark depths. "A weaver's ledger," he breathed, the words heavy with the weight of the old country. A message hidden in the knots, an old art, a woman's art. The men, we never thought to look. "Orloff's men took the locket because they thought it held a secret," Lorenzo said, his mind racing, connecting the pieces with lethal speed. A microfilm, a name on a slip of paper. They took the lock, but they left the treasure chest behind. He looked at Serafina, and for the first time, she saw not a predator, but a partner. "Giardino's. Is it still there?" "The restaurant closed 10 years ago," Serafina said. "It's a vape shop now. But the owner, Mr. Pacino, he was old. He might still be in the neighborhood." "Find him," Lorenzo commanded into his phone, already dialing. "Now." The hunt led them to a dusty corner of Little Italy, a neighborhood that was a ghost of its former self. Mr. Pacino had passed away, but his son ran a small bakery 2 blocks from where Giardino's used to be. He was a nervous man who paled when Lorenzo Falcone walked through his door at 2 in the morning. "The tablecloths," the man stammered, wiping flour from his hands onto his apron. "My father. He couldn't bear to throw them away. He said they were art. He put everything in a storage unit in Cicero when he sold the place." An hour later, Serafina stood before a roll-up metal door in a desolate, poorly lit storage facility. One of Lorenzo's men cut the old lock with a pair of bolt cutters. The door rattled open, releasing a stale breath of mothballs and memory. Inside, stacked to the ceiling, were boxes of old restaurant supplies, and in a set of heavy wooden chests, wrapped in yellowing muslin, were the tablecloths. Lorenzo's men began to pull them out, laying the heavy damask cloths on the dusty concrete floor. To them, they were identical, white, with intricate, traditional patterns woven in. But to Serafina, they were a library of her grandmother's life. She knelt, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns. She didn't need light, she could read them by touch. "This one was for Easter," she murmured. feeling the subtle pattern of lilies woven into the border. This one was for a wedding. Doves. She moved from one to the next, her hands flying over the fabric. She was searching for an anomaly, a flaw, a secret signature. "Here," she finally said, her voice catching. She had found it. On a large, banquet-sized cloth in the bottom right corner was a tiny, deliberate imperfection. A single knot, tied in a way only another weaver would recognize. It was the Bellini family mark. Her mark. "This is it," she said, looking up at Lorenzo. "This is the one." Back in the Falcone library, they spread the massive tablecloth across a polished mahogany table that was itself a relic of 100 secret meetings. Under the bright, modern lights, the cloth seemed to glow. To Lorenzo, it was still just an exquisitely made piece of linen. To Serafina, it was a book written in a language only she could read. "It's a Sicilian mourning pattern," she explained, her fingers tracing the threads. "It tells the story of a funeral, but the colors are wrong." She pointed to a thin, almost invisible line of thread woven into the pattern. It was a deep, dark red, the color of dried blood. "This thread shouldn't be here. And this one," she indicated a thread of pure gold. "This is the thread of a traitor's payment." For the next 2 hours, with Don Marco and Lorenzo watching in rapt silence, she deciphered the story her grandmother had woven 3 decades ago. It was a chronicle of the betrayal in 1988. It named names, dates, and locations. It detailed how a shipment of Falcone assets was deliberately sabotaged, not by a rival family, but by a trusted ally who had been secretly colluding with the Bratva. The man who orchestrated it all was Dmitry Orlov, Victor's father. The betrayal had been designed to frame Don Marco's most loyal consigliere, a man he loved like a brother, forcing Marco to order his death, a death that had shattered him and cemented the Orlov family's power in the city's underworld. "She saw it," Serafina whispered, her hands resting on the cloth. "My nonna. She was delivering tablecloths that night. She saw Dmitry Orlov meeting with the man who was framed. She heard the plan. She knew she couldn't go to the Don. Orlov was too close to him, so she fled. But before she left, she wove her testimony. She left the truth on the table for anyone with the eyes to see it. And no one ever did," Don Marco said, his voice choked with a grief 30 years old. He had killed an innocent man, a friend, a brother. Lorenzo's face was stone. The cold, calculated rage had returned, but now it was focused, honed to a razor's edge. Victor built his empire on a lie. He inherited a throne of bones and blood that belonged to us. He looked at the tablecloth, then at Serafina. "This is our proof. But it's not enough to show it. We have to make him confess. We have to make him own his father's sin in front of everyone he thinks he controls." The plan was audacious, a piece of theater worthy of the grandest opera. Lorenzo sent out invitations for an emergency summit of the city's underworld leaders to be held at the Ethelgard. The pretense was a peace offering, a proposal to officially cede the disputed port territories to Victor Orlov, a public admission of defeat. Orlov, drunk on his recent victory and blinded by his own arrogance, accepted immediately. To see the great Lorenzo Falcone bend the knee would be the ultimate triumph. He had no idea he was walking into his own funeral. 2 nights later, the Ethelgard was once again a vault of tension. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and simmering violence. The heads of the city's most powerful factions sat at a large, round table in the main dining room, a council of predators. Victor Orlov was at the head of the table, flanked by his men, a smug, triumphant grin on his face. Don Marco sat opposite him, looking old and defeated. Lorenzo stood by his father's side, his face a mask of grim resignation. The first course was served. The second. The conversation was stilted, heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, Lorenzo tapped his glass with a knife. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "We are here tonight to end a war that has cost us all. The Falcone family has reconsidered its position. We are prepared to concede the southern ports to Mr. Orloff." A murmur went through the room. Orloff's grin widened. He raised his glass of vodka. "A wise decision, Lorenzo. It is good to know your place." He took a long drink, his eyes mocking the old Don. "To new beginnings." "Indeed," Lorenzo said, his voice dangerously soft. "To new beginnings. And to settling old debts." On cue, the main kitchen doors swung open. But it wasn't a waiter who emerged. It was Serafina. She was not wearing her uniform. She wore a simple, elegant dress of deep crimson silk. Her hair was down, falling in dark waves around her shoulders. She walked with a quiet, unshakable confidence that commanded the attention of every man in the room. She was no longer a shadow. She was the fire that cast the shadows. In her hands, she carried a single, folded white tablecloth. Orloff's smile faltered. He looked at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "The waitress. You have a habit of showing up where you don't belong." Serafina walked directly to the head of the table. She didn't look at Orloff. She addressed the assembled dons. "In the old country," she began, her voice calm and clear, "history was not always written in books. Sometimes it was woven into the fabric of our lives." With a fluid, dramatic gesture, she unfurled the tablecloth, letting it cascade over the table, covering the pristine white linen already there. The intricate mourning pattern, with its hidden threads of blood and gold, was displayed for all to see. "This cloth was woven 30 years ago by my grandmother, Ariana Bellini," she said. "It is a testament, a story of a great betrayal that has poisoned this city for a generation." She moved her hand over the fabric, her fingers dancing over the knots and threads, and she began to read. She read the story of Dmitri Orloff's treachery, of the frame-up, of the murder of an innocent man. Her voice never wavered. She spoke with the authority of a historian reading from a sacred text. When she finished, a stunned silence hung in the air. Orloff burst out laughing, a harsh, ugly sound. "This is your proof? A tablecloth? The girl is insane. It is a fairy tale." "Every story needs a signature," Serafina said, her dark eyes finally locking with his. A way to prove the artist's hand. She turned to Lorenzo. He nodded to one of his guards, who stepped forward and placed a small object on the table, the tarnished silver locket. "My men recovered this from the lowlife you sent to steal it," Lorenzo said to Orloff. "You thought it held the key, didn't you? You tore it apart, looking for something that wasn't there." "The locket was empty," Orloff sneered. "Not quite," Serafina said. She picked it up. With a delicate touch, she pressed a nearly invisible seam on its side. A tiny, hidden compartment sprang open. With the tips of her fingers, she pulled out not a slip of paper, not a photograph, but a single, tightly wound thread of deep, blood-red silk. She held it up. Then she reached down to the corner of the tablecloth and, with a small, sharp tug, pulled the corresponding thread from the woven pattern. She held the two threads side by side in the light. They were identical. "The thread remembers," she whispered. The bomb had detonated. The proof was absolute, its logic irrefutable, and its presentation a masterpiece of theatrical justice. The other dons stared at Orloff, their faces shifting from confusion to cold, hard fury. They had been doing business with the son of a traitor, a man whose entire legacy was built on a lie that had dishonored them all. Orlov's face had turned ashen. He was trapped. He looked wildly around the room, but found only the merciless eyes of his judges. His empire crumbled in that single, silent moment. Don Marco Falcone rose slowly to his feet. He looked not at Orlov, but at Serafina, his eyes filled with a profound, sorrowful gratitude. He had found his absolution in the hands of a weaver's granddaughter. 1 year later, the scent of lemon groves and salt spray filled the air. On a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the glittering coast of Sicily, Serafina placed a basket of warm, crusty bread on a long wooden table. She was home. Using a small part of the fortune Lorenzo insisted she accept as restitution, she had bought back her family's ancestral land and restored the old stone farmhouse. She had also established a small workshop, a school where the young women of the village could learn the ancient art of weaving, ensuring the threads of their history would never be forgotten. Lorenzo emerged from the house, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hand stained with dirt from the vineyard. He had handed the day-to-day operations of the Falcone Empire to a trusted successor, choosing to build a new life here with her, a life of soil and sun, not steel and shadow. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "The first harvest is looking good," he murmured into her hair. "It seems some things are worth waiting for." At the far end of the terrace, Don Marco sat in a wicker chair, a blanket over his knees, watching the sea. He was quiet these days, but it was a peaceful quiet. The ghosts that had haunted him for 30 years had finally been laid to rest. He looked over at them and smiled, a genuine, contented smile. Serafina leaned back against Lorenzo, her heart full. She had walked out of the shadows not to join a world of kings and killers, but to find her own. She had learned that a person's true strength wasn't in mastering the art of invisibility, but in understanding that even the most overlooked threads, when woven together with truth, could create a legacy strong enough to rewrite the world.